And the second?
Ironically enough, it was 20 years later, 2019. By that point, my marriage was just being ripped apart, and my health was really starting to fail me. And I knew I was finally going to have to take drastic action just to survive. And so I could be the strongest dad for my kids too. The major issues all started back in 2012, and it took 7 years to finally take that step.
Matt, why do you think it took so long?
Just pure fear, pure terror. I was just afraid. I was afraid of loss. I was afraid of my kids coming from a broken home. And truthfully, I was afraid of being abandoned and alone.
What turned on the light for you?
It was probably an accumulation of a lot of things, but one night I was out walking and listening to a podcast. And I couldn't tell you who said it. I can't tell you the name of the podcast. All I remember is the quote. And it just stopped me just dead in my tracks. Now, it sounds really simple. It sounds like common sense. But when you're in the mess like that, a quote like this can be very illuminating. And the quote was this: "It's not your responsibility to make someone else happy." Over the course of 20 years, a lot of things accumulate. And the handwriting had been on the wall for a long time. But I had been kind of living in this fantasy land of how I wished things would be instead of how they were. So I had to step out of fantasy land and step into the truth of my circumstances and acknowledge this is how things are. The storm was coming either way. And so I could either just lay down and let it blow me away, or I could batten down the hatches and get ready for it.
Okay, well, what was that preparation like?
Everything had to change. The way I eat, the way I drink, the way I train, the way I think, the way I walk with the Lord, the way I pray, the way I live. Everything had to change. I had to become the man I'd always aspired to be, the man God always intended me to be. And I was not going to apologize for it.
And what happened when you started making changes?
Well, when you change things, things change. And not everyone responds positively. So you better make sure you got a rock solid, fail-proof reason for what you're doing. Otherwise, fear is going to turn you into a coward again, and you'll run away every time, and nothing's ever going to change. So what's stirring in you right now? What's preventing you from taking action? Is it fear? Confusion? Maybe you're just refusing to see reality the way it is. See, when things get hard, when we're faced with difficult choices, We often run away to fantasy land to comfort ourselves. The problem is that we have such a skewed mindset so often when it comes to reality and perceiving things the way they are. And we're nearly always going to lean to whatever's going to make us the most comfortable. The culture and society have taught us so many unrealistic expectations. Life's not fair. And God never promised us equity, but He did promise us a home. But you see, on this side of heaven, there is no 100% comfort. There never will be. There's always going to be some burden to bear. And if you're going to change your life, if you're going to become the person that you always aspired to be, then you have to learn to bear and embrace the burdens that benefit you. It's a burden to be disciplined and eat healthy, but it's also a burden to be overweight with health issues. It's a burden to consistently exercise, but it's also a burden to be out of shape with no energy. It's a burden to have hard conversations, but it's also a burden to ignore serious issues because they're just going to pile up into resentment and bitterness. And it's a burden to risk losing a relationship by doing what is right. But it's also a burden when that same relationship threatens your very life because you cower in fear. We cannot become the ones we've aspired to be until we accept reality and choose to bear the burdens that benefit us. But before we do that, before we can start writing our redemption stories, we've got to become friends with someone we really don't like. A person named personal responsibility. Whether it's total transformation or writing your redemption story, you've got to begin by making two new pals. The first one of those is personal responsibility. And you've got to begin by really taking a hard look and distinguishing what is your responsibility, what is not your responsibility. So let's take a look first at what you are not responsible for. You're not responsible for making others happy. You're not responsible for other people's feelings, other people's decisions, other people's actions, or other people's beliefs. A lot of people were raised to be people pleasers, or taught that they were somehow responsible for making or keeping other people happy. And we feel like if somebody in our family or our circle isn't happy or fulfilled enough, then somehow their unhappiness is our problem. Maybe even our fault. But that's just not true. And you've got to get away from clinging to truths that just aren't true. From holding on to beliefs that just aren't true. But there's a flip side, right? There's always another side of the coin. And just like you're not responsible for these things for other people, there are things that you're responsible for. Such as, you are responsible for your own happiness. You're responsible for all your feelings, your emotions, your actions, your reactions, your responses. You are responsible for everything in your life. And I know this is hard, but once you begin to embrace that, you're going to level up. Now look, you're not responsible for the things that other people have chosen to do to you. You're not responsible for the choices that other people have made that have impacted you. But you are responsible for being in that relationship. You are responsible for having remained in that relationship without consequences, without boundaries. That's all on you. You see, up until this point, your life is an accumulation of the choices you've made, like it or not. And your life going forward will be a reflection of the choices you make from this point on. So what's it going to be? We're all self-made. Every last one of us. We are all self-made. But only the healthy, the wealthy, and the happy will admit that. So we've got to ground ourselves in the reality of what is. The reality about others and that we're in relationship with, and the reality of who we are. The reality of the lives that we have chosen to build. Because the life that you have is the life that you have built. You've got to be able to admit it. If you're out of shape with no energy, it's your fault. If you're fat and overweight, it's your fault. If you're in a job that doesn't pay well or you have a lack of credentials, that is your fault. If you're unhappy or you're in an unhealthy marriage, that is your fault. Again, you're not responsible for what other people have done. But if you have an unfulfilled life, that's your fault. If you're carrying other people's baggage to your own detriment, that is your fault. The question is, what are you going to do about it now? Are you going to keep putting those things on other people or on circumstances? Or are you going to embrace that this is your responsibility? Are you going to begin to live intentionally, free of excuses? Or are you just going to keep blaming everybody and everything else?